Hi everyone, so in this lesson I'm going to go over translating sine and cosine. So to translate sine and cosine, you kind of have to understand the formula. So these are your formulas and they're kind of both similar. The only thing that's different is that this has sine and this one is cosine. All the letters pretty much mean the same thing. A is the amplitude, B is your frequency, negative H is your horizontal shift, and K is your vertical shift. Vertical shift. Now, if the H is negative, it's going to shift right. And if the H is positive, it's going to shift left. If the K is positive, it's going to go up. And if the K is negative, it's going to go down. So in this formula, there's something that is really important. It's the last value. The last value represents something called the midline. And what the midline is it's that halfway line between the max and the min for the sine and cosine graph. So if I made a graph of sine, no matter where I started, the midline is where it separates the graph perfectly halfway. So if you notice, this piece here is perfectly symmetrical to this, and it's cut halfway in between. For cosine, it'd be very similar, except cosine starts at your max, and it goes back up to your max. So you'd want the midline to be perfectly halfway between the max and the min. So there's actually a formula for it besides the fact that it's K. It's max plus the min divided by 2. So if I saw this graph here, my maximum's at -1 and my minimum's at -5. So if I do my max -5 plus my min -1, divide that by 2, I get -6 divided by 2, -3, which is where your midline would be, which is telling me that the K value in this equation would be -3. So basically your midline is just the halfway point between your max and your min, and it's really important because what it does is it takes the x-axis and basically shifts it towards it, down. Hence why it's called a vertical shift in the formula. So here's some examples. If I asked you to state the type of transformation that happened on it, you would be able to. The parent function here is sine, and we can see that inside the parentheses there's a -π/4, and if you remember, inside means move left or right from our previous lessons. So if it's a -π/4, we're going to be moving right π/4. This guy here, he has a negative, a 1/2, and a 3. This negative is actually going to reflect sine over the x-axis. The 1/2 is your frequency, and then the 3 is your vertical shift up. It's also your midline. This also would give you your midline here. Now what the frequency of 1/2 is also doing to the graph, it's making it not as wide. If you were to graph this one, it would be a little shorter. So this is called a horizontal shrink. This guy down here, again, another reflection over x. This is a plus π/2, so it's moving left π/2 units. And this guy is going up 1, which is also giving your midline y = 1. This guy here, that's your amplitude of 3. That's allowing the graph to do a vertical stretch. Because what's happening with the sine curve, it's going like this, and now the amplitude's 3, so it's going to start to get taller. This guy here is your left pi shift, and this guy over here is your vertical shift down 2 units. It also tells you your midline's equation, and in this case it would be y equals -2 is my midline. So these are some Regents questions that we're going to practice. So here's your equation. This is my A, this is my B, this is my C, and my D. They want you to state which one is incorrect. So the first thing they say is the period is 6. Well, we know that the period's formula is 2 pi over B. So if I take my B and I plug it in, I get 2 pi over 3. And if we keep the 2 pi, change and flip the 3 pi, pi over 3 to 3 over pi, the pi's will cancel and you get 6. So this is a true statement. So the first statement's good. The amplitude is 3. Well, I'd get that from my A value. Remember, amplitude is the absolute value of A. So take the absolute value of -3, I do get 3. So this one is good. The range is 4 to 10, and the midline is -4. To get my range, I got to see how high and low this graph goes. So either you can graph it in your calculator, or what you can do is visualize it. So wherever the midline is, it doesn't really matter. But for a sine curve, it starts on the midline, and then it ends on the midline. It's on the midline halfway through. It's going to go up 3, however high that is, and go down 3. So I'm going to add 3 and then subtract 3 from my midline. My midline is my K value, which is right here. So if my midline's 7 and I take away 3 from 7, I'm going to get 4. If I add 3 to 7, I'm going to get 10. So this statement is true. What is not true is the midline is -4. You can clearly see in the equation that 7 is K, so that this should really say that Y is 7. This question asks you, what is the shift? Well, we can see that there's a plus pi over 3 on the inside, so this is going left pi over 3 because it's inside the parentheses. This guy says, which function's graph has a period of 8 and reaches a maximum height of 1 if at least one full period is graphed? So first off, I want to find which one has a period of 8. Remember, 2 pi over B. These guys both have the same B value, so I'm going to see if they satisfy a period of 8. So I'll keep, change, and flip. These guys will cancel and we'll get 8. So these are good options. These are not good options because they're 8. Their B value is 8. So there's no way you're going to make 2 pi over B become 8 because this will become pi over 4. So that's not true. That period's wrong. To get a maximum height of 1, what I'm going to do is visualize the graph. So we know that choice 1 has a midline of -3 because of this, and an amplitude of 4, positive 4. Remember, you take the absolute value of it to get the amplitude. Okay, so also what I'm going to realize is that this is a negative, so it's also going to reflect. So instead of starting at the maximum, the cosine graph is going to start at its minimum and go like this. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to figure out how high and how low these values are. So when I add 4 to -3, I'm going to get 1, and when I subtract 4 from -3, I get -7. So actually I think this is my answer, but I'm going to double check it with choice 2. So my midline of choice 2 is 5, and I have a cosine curve. It's also reflected because of the negative. And I'm going to add 4 and subtract 4 from 5. And I'm going to get 5 plus 4, which is 9. So this can't be it. So it has to be choice 1. In this question, it says the function of a cos bx plus c is plotted on the graph shown below. They want the values of a, b, and c. Now, the first thing I always try to find is my midline, because that's kind of easy to find. It's between the halfway of the max and the min. So we know that c, because it's added to the end, is actually d in our formula, but k, our midline, so k is 3. So we know that c has to be 3, because that's being added to the end, so that's where your midline is. So it cannot be choices 2 or 3. The amplitude we know is 2, because it goes up 2 from 3, so it has to be choice 1. So this question says, given the parent function cos of x, so we're dealing with a cosine curve, which we know looks like this, which phrase best describes the transformation if we do this to it? So we know that it's going plus a on the inside of the parentheses, which is left a units, and it has a negative b, so it's going down b units. What they mean by positive constants is that they're positive numbers. So like, for example, plus a could be like plus 7, and down b could be minus 8. The reason why they're saying it's positive constants is that if you put in a, like, say, a negative 8, the negative and negative would cancel, and then it would defeat the purpose of this negative out there. Anyway, so our answer is left A and down B. So left A units, down B units would be choice 4. And this last question, it says on the curve below, sketch at least one cycle of the sine curve with an amplitude of 2, a midline of negative 3 over 2, and a period of 2 pi. Now, first off, we know what a sine curve looks like. It looks like this. They're saying that the amplitude is 2, and the midline is negative 3 over 2. So, like, negative 3 over 2 is going to be the midline, which, if you convert it to a decimal, might be easier. So let's make it negative 1.5. It's going to go up 2 from that and down 2 from that. So we're going to add 2 and subtract 2 from that. And the period is 2 pi, which means that it takes 2 pi to make one full cycle. So that means this is 0 and this is 2 pi. So I'm going to first set up my graph. So I got 0, 2 pi, pi, pi over 2, and 3 pi over 2. I'm going to space this out so I can see what's going on. I know that negative 1.5 is really important because that's my midline. And if I do negative 1.5 plus 2, that's going to get me 0.5. If I do negative 1.5 minus 2 to get my minimum, that's going to get me negative 3.5. So my maximum value is going to be at 0.5, and my minimum value is negative 3.5. So we know what a sine curve looks like. I'm going to make my new 0 there because the midline's now shifted down. This is going to be my other 0, and this is going to be my halfway 0. We know sine goes up at pi over 2 to its maximum, and it goes down at 3 pi over 2 to its minimum. This is my one cycle. Now they ask you what's the differences between the sketch of the, obviously, part A, and a sketch of this guy. Now, a sketch of this guy, the difference clearly is this piece right here. We have an amplitude of 2 on our graph, and we do have a midline. This is your midline because it's added to the end. This is your amplitude, which we do have an amplitude of 2, and we do have a midline. The value is 1 for the b, so 2 pi over b is still 2 pi over 1, which is 2 pi, so that's the same. But this is different, and what's different is going to be that the graph would be shifted pi over 3 to the right. So overall, with this equation, A is your amplitude. This can be sine or cosine. B is your frequency, which can tell you whether or not it's a horizontal stretch or shrink. This negative h is left or right. If it's negative, it's right, and if it's positive, it's left. And this k over here is your vertical shift up or down. If it's positive, it's up. If it's negative, it's down. And k also gives you the equation of the midline. So your midline is always the equation y equals k.